On June 6, 1944, many Allied soldiers landed on beaches in Normandy, France. This was called D-Day. It was a big turning point in World War II. The goal was to free Europe from Nazi Germany. Some of these soldiers later became famous actors, or they were already actors who joined the fight. Here are the stories of the 5 actors who fought the D-Day. David Niven. Imagine a person who was both a famous movie star and a brave soldier. That was David Niven. He was born in London, England back in 1910. From a young age, he was very charming and had a playful sense of humor. He liked to make people laugh. Little did he know he would one day risk his life on the beaches of Normandy and also become a big Hollywood star. When David Niven was old enough, he joined the British Army. At first, he did not plan to be a professional soldier forever. He left the military to try out different jobs, but soon he found something he loved: acting. He moved to Hollywood, where he began to appear in small film roles. He was handsome, witty, and had an English accent that people enjoyed. His career started growing. Then came World War II. Even though he was doing well in Hollywood, David Niven felt he needed to serve his country again. He returned to England and rejoined the British Army. This time, he became a lieutenant colonel in the British Commandos. Being a commando was not easy. It required special training. Commandos had dangerous missions. They often worked in secret and helped gather intelligence. David Niven also served in intelligence work, meaning he used his clever mind to assist in planning and gathering important information about enemy movements. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, David Niven was among the first officers to land in Normandy. Just think about how terrifying that must have been. The beaches were heavily guarded by enemy forces, and soldiers faced gunfire the moment they landed. Still, David Niven pressed on. He had a duty to do. Some people say he kept a small sense of humor even in those dark moments, telling jokes to calm the nerves of those around him. Whether that's true or not, we know he was a steady and brave leader. After the beaches were taken, David Niven continued to serve with the U.S. 1st Infantry, helping them in their battles. Because of his outstanding service, he was awarded the U.S. Legion of Merit Medal, which is a very special honor. In fact, only 25 British soldiers received that medal. It shows how much the American forces respected his hard work and courage. Once the war was over, David Niven returned to acting. He starred in many famous movies like Around the World in 80 Days and The Pink Panther. Audiences loved his classy style and funny nature. Even though he became very successful in Hollywood, he never forgot his time in the war. He had seen friends lost in battle, and he knew how important it was to protect freedom. David Niven died in 1983, leaving behind a legacy as both a wonderful actor and a true hero. People still watch his films today. Many do not realize that this charming man once landed on the beaches of Normandy, risking his life for the Allied cause. When you see David Niven on the screen, remember that he was more than just a movie star. He was a soldier who showed bravery under fire. That is why his story remains so inspiring. He proved you can be both a performer who brings joy and a fighter who stands up for what is right. Richard Todd. Just like David Niven, he was an actor. But before he ever stepped onto a movie set, he was a soldier in World War II. In fact, he was part of a very special operation on D-Day, one that involved parachutes and a very important bridge. Richard Todd was born in Ireland in 1919. His early life was quite normal. He enjoyed sports, school, and spending time with friends. But when World War II began, he felt the call to serve his country. Todd joined the British Army and trained to be part of the airborne forces. This meant he was a paratrooper who could jump from airplanes behind enemy lines. On the night of June 5, 1944, just hours before the main D-Day landings, Todd and his fellow soldiers flew across the English Channel. Their mission was to land near a place called Pegasus Bridge. This bridge was important because it crossed the Caen Canal. If the Germans used that bridge to bring in tanks and more troops, the Allied soldiers on the beaches would be in great danger. So Richard Todd and his unit had to make sure the bridge stayed in Allied hands. They jumped from the planes in the dark and landed in enemy territory. Imagine how frightening it would be to parachute at night, not knowing where the enemy might be. Yet Todd and his comrades were well trained. They quickly gathered and moved toward Pegasus Bridge. Another group had arrived by glider, crash landing near the bridge and taking control of it. Todd's battalion was the reinforcement team to hold the bridge at all costs. Fighting was fierce, but the British airborne troops managed to secure the area. Todd's commanding officer was a man named Major John Howard. Years later, in 1962, a big movie was made about D-Day called The Longest Day. Richard Todd was cast to play Major John Howard. This was a very special moment because Todd had actually been there in real life. The movie's producer, Darryl F. Zanuck, thought it would make the film more authentic to have a real D-Day veteran in the cast. In the film, Richard Todd wore the same green beret he had used on that brave night. That tiny detail showed how personal the role was for him. After the war, Todd continued acting in many different films. He gained respect for his talent and for his real-life heroism. Watching him on screen, people could see a man who understood the weight of war. But Richard Todd was not just a soldier and an actor. He was also a humble man who didn't boast about his experiences. He carried the memories of D-Day with him, remembering the comrades he lost and the challenges they faced. Sometimes people recognized him more for his movies than for his military service. Yet those who knew him understood that he was part of a historic moment that changed the course of the war. When you watch The Longest Day, pay attention to the scenes at Pegasus Bridge. Remember that Richard Todd was there, in reality and on film. His actions, along with those of many other brave men, helped pave the way for the Allied victory in Normandy. Without these airborne heroes, the story of D-Day might have ended differently. Todd passed away in 2009, but his legacy lives on in history books and on the silver screen. He stands as a symbol of courage, dedication, and a rare kind of authenticity that only someone who truly fought could bring to a movie. Robert Montgomery. Montgomery served in the United States Navy. He had a different path, but was no less courageous. In fact, his story shows how people from different countries joined together for one grand mission on D-Day. Robert Montgomery was born in 1904 in New York. He came from a well-off family, but he faced personal challenges when he was young. Later, he found a way to express himself through acting. He stepped onto Broadway stages, and soon he headed to Hollywood, where he became a leading man in many films of the 1930s. Audiences adored his charm and quick wit on screen. They liked how he could play both serious and lighthearted roles. But everything changed when World War II loomed on the horizon. Even before the United States officially entered the war, Montgomery felt the need to do more. He enlisted in the military. This showed a deep sense of duty to protect freedom. He chose the Navy, where he trained to become an officer. Eventually, he was assigned to command a PT boat. PT boats were small, fast vessels that performed risky missions, often patrolling dangerous waters. When the Allies planned the Normandy invasion, Montgomery's skills and experience were needed. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, he served aboard the USS Barton, a Navy destroyer. Being on a destroyer meant the ship supported the landings by firing at enemy positions and protecting the transport ships from submarines and other threats. It was tense and dangerous work, because German forces still posed a real threat at sea. Robert Montgomery's service did not stop on D-Day. He stayed in active duty for 5 years and was highly respected by his fellow sailors. He earned many honors: a Bronze Star, a Good Conduct Medal, an American Defense Service ribbon, and even the European Theater ribbon with 2 battle stars. That means he took part in 2 major battles in the European area. By the end of the war, he had achieved the rank of lieutenant commander. After the war, Robert Montgomery came back to Hollywood. He was older, and perhaps he saw life differently after experiencing the realities of war. Still, he resumed acting and even tried his hand at producing and directing. He hosted a television series called Robert Montgomery Presents. He used his creativity and leadership skills to bring new shows to audiences at home. An interesting side note is that Montgomery mentored young actors and actresses, helping them understand the film business. Some say he never lost the discipline he gained from his time in the Navy. He was always on time, always professional, and always ready to work. His friends in Hollywood admired him for both his military service and his talent. Robert Montgomery passed away in 1981, leaving behind a legacy of bravery and art. When we watch his movies, we can see a polished actor who knew how to make us laugh, cry, or think. Yet, beneath that movie star presence was a real man who stood on a ship off the coast of Normandy, helping the Allies push toward victory. He reminds us that behind every uniform is a person with hopes, dreams, and fears, but also a strong will to fight for a better world. Charles Durning. Charles Durning had a long career in film and television. Some called him the king of character actors because he could play so many different types of roles. But long before he earned that reputation on screen, he was a soldier on the bloody beaches of Normandy. His story is both heroic and heartbreaking. Charles Durning was born in 1923 in New York. He grew up during the Great Depression, a time when many families struggled. He worked different odd jobs as a teenager. Then, when he turned 18, the United States joined World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Durning enlisted in the U.S. Army. He went through basic training like many other young men, learning how to fire a rifle, follow orders, and be part of a team. The time soon came for D-Day. Early on June 6, 1944, Charles Durning landed on Omaha Beach in one of the first waves of soldiers. Omaha Beach was heavily defended by German forces. Many Allied soldiers did not survive those first few minutes. Bullets rained down, artillery shells exploded, and the entire scene was chaotic and deadly. According to some reports, Durning was the only soldier in his unit to survive that initial landing. Imagine how terrifying that must have been, to see your friends and fellow soldiers falling around you. Despite these horrors, Charles Durning continued forward. He had a job to do, and that was to push inland and help secure a foothold in France. Only 9 days later, he was wounded in action. This injury meant he needed medical attention, and so he was taken off the front lines for some time. He recovered, but it left a lasting impact on him, physically and emotionally. War changes a person, and Durning was no exception. For his bravery, he received several honors, including the Purple Heart, which is awarded to those who are wounded in battle, and the Silver Star, one of the highest awards for gallantry in combat. These medals show that Durning demonstrated courage under fire and helped his fellow soldiers in a time of grave danger. After the war, he did not speak much about these experiences for a long while. Sometimes, survivors of intense battles find it painful to relive those moments in words. Eventually, Charles Durning turned to acting, finding it a form of expression and perhaps a way to move forward. He appeared in many films, such as Dog Day Afternoon, Tootsie, and The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. He was often recognized for bringing depth and sincerity to every role he played. People in Hollywood knew him as a professional actor who arrived on set prepared and gave everything he had to his performance. Over time, Durning began to share bits of his wartime stories, speaking at events and meeting with veterans. He wanted to honor those who did not come home from Normandy. He wanted future generations to understand the real cost of war. He passed away in 2012, leaving behind a legacy of memorable performances and an example of true heroism. When we remember Charles Durning, we should not only think of his roles in front of the camera, but also picture the young soldier who stepped off a landing craft into a storm of bullets, determined to do his part. James Doohan. You might know James Doohan as Scotty from the original Star Trek series. He was the beloved engineer who kept the Starship Enterprise running. But before he ever beamed anyone up on television, James Doohan was a real-life hero at D-Day with the Canadian Army. This is the story of how he landed on Juno Beach and faced danger that could have ended his life. James Doohan was born in 1920 in Vancouver, Canada. Growing up, he showed signs of being a smart and curious boy. Some say he had a natural talent for math and science. But when World War II broke out, he decided to serve his country. He joined the Royal Canadian Artillery. This branch of the military handled big guns and cannons. Later, he became part of the Canadian forces preparing for the Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, Doohan and his fellow Canadian soldiers landed on Juno Beach. Just like Omaha Beach, Juno was heavily defended. Gunfire and explosions were everywhere. Yet the Canadians pressed forward, determined to take the beach. Doohan was right there with them, using his training to help his unit advance and hold their position. The battle was intense, and many brave soldiers were hurt or killed. Doohan was one of the injured. He was shot several times, in the leg and the chest. Miraculously, he survived these wounds. However, a bullet also took off his right middle finger. Despite this serious injury, James Doohan recovered and continued to serve. It takes a lot of courage to keep going after going through something that traumatic. After the war ended, he chose to explore a different career path. He looked for a way to use his voice and creativity. Acting seemed perfect for him. He started performing in radio and TV roles in Canada, eventually moving to the United States. In the 1960s, James Doohan got his most famous part, Montgomery Scotty Scott in the TV show Star Trek. This role required him to speak with a Scottish accent and to show engineering know-how. Whenever Captain Kirk needed more power for the warp engines, Scotty would find a solution. People loved his character for being loyal, smart, and sometimes a bit gruff, but always warm-hearted underneath. His experiences in the war may have helped him play a role that required quick thinking in stressful situations. Doohan would sometimes hide his missing finger on camera, positioning his hand so audiences wouldn't notice. But if you watch closely, you can see glimpses of it. Over time, fans learned about his war injuries, and it made them respect him even more. He was not just an actor pretending to be a hero. He was a real hero who had faced death on the beaches of Normandy. James Doohan passed away in 2005. Star Trek fans still celebrate him, honoring the way he brought Scotty to life. But anyone who knows about D-Day should also remember James Doohan's bravery as a young soldier. He risked everything to help bring freedom to Europe. When you think of him, imagine the determined soldier on Juno Beach, fighting with courage and not letting his injuries stop him from living a meaningful life afterward. That's what makes his story so special. He showed dedication both on the battlefield and on the screen. They were not alone. Many others took part in World War II, but not all fought D-Day. Here are the stories of other names, exploring what really happened, where they served, and why their stories sometimes get tangled with the legend of D-Day. Henry Fonda served in the Pacific. Henry Fonda is one of the most respected actors of Hollywood's golden era. Known for films like The Grapes of Wrath, 12 Angry Men, and Once Upon a Time in the West, Fonda had an illustrious career that spanned decades. His calm demeanor and distinctive voice made him an iconic leading man. But for many, Fonda is also remembered as a World War II veteran. Fonda's naval service took him to the Pacific Theater, a vast area of operations where the U.S. and Allied forces fought Japan. Specifically, he served on the USS Curtis, an American seaplane tender that provided support to naval aircraft. The duties of a seaplane tender could include refueling, repairing planes, and managing scouting operations. These responsibilities, while not as glamorous as being on a famous battleship or aircraft carrier, were crucial to the broader war effort. In June 1944, the time of the Normandy invasion, Henry Fonda and the Curtis were stationed at or near the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, very far from the beaches of Normandy. The Marshalls were part of a major island hopping campaign designed to push Japanese forces back toward their home islands. In other words, while the Allies launched the D-Day operation in Europe, Henry Fonda was actively serving, but in the Pacific. That fact alone explains why he could not have been to Normandy for the Allied landings. After the war, Henry Fonda returned to Hollywood and resumed his acting career with renewed vigor. Films like Fort Apache and Mr. Roberts showcased both his versatility and seriousness gained from wartime experience. Yet, over time, some fans and writers conflated his military service with the European campaign, perhaps simply because his name was associated with major conflicts. Additionally, Fonda did portray characters involved in the Normandy landings in films such as The Longest Day, leading some viewers to assume he was reenacting events he personally experienced. He played Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., one of the key figures at Utah Beach. Because of that role, many ended up believing Fonda himself had been present. However, that was purely a film role. The real Henry Fonda's war story happened thousands of miles away in the Pacific. Alec Guinness, Royal Navy, but elsewhere. If you've ever watched Star Wars, you know Alec Guinness as the wise and gentle mentor Obi-Wan Kenobi. Older generations also remember him for classic films like The Bridge on the River Kwai, for which he won an Oscar, and his roles in various Ealing comedies. But behind that dignified screen presence was a man who wore a Royal Navy uniform during World War II. By June 1944, Alec Guinness was still serving in the Royal Navy, but his assignments were more related to the Mediterranean region. He saw action at various points, and there are records of him being involved in preparing for the invasion of southern France in August 1944, Operation Dragoon. Each of these events was significant, yet separate from Operation Overlord, the code name for the Normandy landings. Nevertheless, rumors likely started because Guinness had experience with landing craft and was a well-known British figure. Sometimes fans assume that if a British actor served in the Royal Navy and had involvement with amphibious invasions, he must have been in Normandy as well. That's an understandable assumption, but historically incorrect. Following the war, Alec Guinness returned to stage and screen with a deeper understanding of duty and sacrifice. His range of roles was breathtaking, from comedic characters in The Lady Killers to the stoic Colonel Nicholson in The Bridge on the River Kwai. Later generations, of course, saw him in Star Wars as Obi-Wan Kenobi, a part that made him known worldwide. Art Linkletter, the Misattributed War Service. Art Linkletter was a television and radio personality most famous for shows like House Party and People Are Funny. His easygoing style and warm sense of humor made him a household name from the 1940s through the 1960s. Because he was so beloved, stories emerged that he too was at D-Day. Arthur Gordon Kelly was born in 1912 in Canada, but was adopted and raised in the United States. He showed an early talent for public speaking and comedic timing. By the late 1930s, he was working on radio, making a name for himself with his quick wit and ability to engage audiences. When World War II began, Linkletter was in his early 30s, well established in the entertainment industry. Records don't indicate that Art Linkletter served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. In fact, he had already built a career as a radio personality and was rapidly transitioning to television by the mid-1940s. By the time D-Day occurred in June 1944, Linkletter was continuing his broadcasting career in the U.S. Some confusion might stem from the fact that he was a Canadian-born entertainer, and Canada was heavily involved in the Normandy landings at Juno Beach. However, Linkletter himself was not among the Canadian troops. Art Linkletter had a long television career, hosting programs that often brought veterans or active duty soldiers onto his shows. Over time, misinformation might have circulated, especially since people often conflate a celebrity's support for the troops with actual service. Additionally, Linkletter became well known for philanthropic work, which sometimes included supporting veteran organizations. None of this equates to him being at D-Day. Sometimes fans who see old photos of Linkletter with servicemen or participating in USO events assume he must have served overseas. While many Hollywood and radio personalities did go overseas to entertain troops, that is not the same as being a soldier or being part of the invasion forces. In short, the official record does not show any deployment to Normandy for Art Linkletter. Dirk Bogard served in Northwest Europe after D-Day. Dirk Bogard was a celebrated British film star, once considered the biggest box office draw in Britain. His roles spanned everything from wartime dramas to art films later in his career. You may have seen him in Death in Venice, 1971, or The Servant, 1963. Sometimes he is included on lists of actors who participated in D-Day, but the truth is a bit more nuanced. Bogard did serve in the Northwest Europe campaign, but he arrived after June 6th. Bogard was born Derek Jules Gaspard Ulrich Niven van den Bogard in 1921. He was of mixed heritage, with a Belgian-born father, which gave him a somewhat cosmopolitan upbringing. As a young man, He studied art and showed a passion for acting. However, World War II altered his life path. In 1939, as Britain prepared for war, Bogard joined the Territorial Army, an armed reserve. He later served in the Queen's Royal Regiment. By the time of Operation Overlord, Bogard was attached to the intelligence section of his unit. After the beaches had been taken, Allied forces pushed inland. Over the following weeks and months, more troops arrived from England to reinforce and expand the front. Bogard was among those who landed after the initial invasion. This means he fought in Northwest Europe, seeing action in France, Belgium, and eventually Germany. He saw the aftermath of concentration camps and was profoundly affected by the devastation he witnessed. The confusion arises because he fought in the same campaign. The liberation of Northwest Europe, often referred to collectively as D-Day in a broad sense, but was not present on June 6th at the beaches. Some people use D-Day as a shorthand for the entire Normandy operation, which continued well beyond the initial landings. This can lead to misunderstandings about who exactly landed on June 6th. After demobilization, Dirk Bogard embarked fully on a film career. He starred in numerous British films of the 1950s, often in romantic or comedic roles. Later, he shifted to more challenging and dramatic characters, which earned him critical acclaim. By the time he retired from acting, Bogard had left a deep mark on British and international cinema. The key takeaway is that Dirk Bogard's service was commendable and included the European front, but not on the specific day of June 6, 1944, when the initial Normandy landings took place. It's an important distinction that honors both the men who were on those landing craft that morning and those who came in the weeks and months that followed to complete the liberation of Europe. People are naturally drawn to heroic stories, especially about beloved actors, musicians, or public figures. Attaching a famous name to a significant historical event can make that event feel more tangible or dramatic. In some cases, confusion begins innocently. An actor who fought in the war might mention, "I served in Europe in 1944," and listeners assume that meant D-Day. Or they might play a role in a movie about Normandy and allow folks to believe they had personal experience of that day. World War II wasn't just fought by ordinary people. It also saw plenty of celebrities and future stars trading the spotlight for a uniform. Even though many of these famous faces had dreamt of success on the big screen, they put their acting ambitions on hold to help their countries. It's pretty impressive when you think about it. They risked their lives, then came back and lit up Hollywood. Here are a few stories that show just how real and varied their wartime experiences could be. James Stewart. Take James Stewart, for instance. He was already a big name thanks to films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But when war came, he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps. Stewart flew bombing missions over Europe, eventually reaching the rank of colonel. He even stayed in the Air Force Reserve after the war. You can bet his wartime service had a big impact on the grounded, everyman appeal he brought to roles later on. Clark Gable. Then there's Clark Gable, star of Gone with the Wind. After his wife Carol Lombard tragically died in a plane crash, Gable was devastated and joined the U.S. Army Air Forces. He was part of a motion picture unit, creating training films, but he also flew on a few combat missions. Can you imagine? One of Hollywood's biggest leading men risking his life in the skies over Germany. Ronald Reagan. In a different part of the military world, you'll find Ronald Reagan, who was still an up-and-coming actor when he joined the U.S. Army. Because of his poor eyesight, he mostly made training films for the Air Force, but those films were vital for boosting morale and teaching new recruits. Reagan's experience in the service and later in the Screen Actors Guild eventually led him into politics. And, well, we all know how that turned out.